The first thing Clarabelle heard was the wind, clawing at the loose boards of the ranch house like a hungry animal, and the second thing she heard was a man's voice inside, low, rough, tired, speaking to God as if he had run out of people to speak to instead. And that was enough to stop her hand before she knocked. Because out on the plains, a woman alone learned to measure danger by sound. And loneliness had its own sound, deeper than anger, sharper than grief. It was the sound of a soul with nothing left to lose. And on a night when the sky had turned the color of cold iron, Clara stood on that porch with dust on her widow's dress, one worn carpetbag in her hand, and listened to a stranger ask heaven for company before winter buried him alive in silence. She had not come to the Barstow spread looking for tenderness. She had come because the town behind her had finally shown its teeth, because a widow with no brothers, no father, and no money was never treated like a person for long, only like an arrangement waiting to happen. Every offer she had received in the last month had carried a price under the politeness. So when the livery boy told her there was a ranch north of town where a man lived by himself since burying his family, she had not thought of salvation, only of 4 walls and 1 night of peace. But now, with rain beginning to spit across the porch and that prayer still hanging inside the house like smoke, Clara felt something she did not trust. Then the floor creaked inside, then silence, then a chair scraping back. And when the door opened, the man standing there looked less like a rancher than a storm that had once been human. He was broad in the shoulders, hard in the jaw, older than she first guessed because sorrow had carved years into his face faster than time ever could. His beard was rough, his hands marked by rope burn and work. His eyes stopped on her black dress, then her bag, then her face, and for one long moment, neither of them spoke. Because the truth was plain enough, she needed shelter, and he needed something he did not yet know how to name. You can tell a great deal about a broken person by the way they make room for another, and Elias Barstow stepped aside without a word. Not warm, only careful, Clara crossed the threshold. The room smelled of bitter coffee, cedar smoke, and the stubborn remains of a life that had once been shared by more than one set of boots. She saw a child's wooden horse on the mantel before he turned it face down. Saw the second cup hanging under the shelf, though no one had used it in years. And when he finally asked, "You running from something?" his voice was so flat that the question felt almost merciful. Clara set down her bag and looked him in the eye. "I am running from what comes after a husband dies, when the world decides you are easier to bargain for than to comfort." And something passed through his face then. Not surprise, not pity, only recognition. He poured coffee into a chipped cup and pushed it toward her. Outside the rain came harder, hemming the house away from the rest of creation. And inside the silence settled between them, not like emptiness, but like a third presence. And that was when she said it, half from exhaustion, half from defense. With the bitter edge of a woman, too tired to soften the truth, "You don't need a wife, Mr. Barstow." And his eyes lifted from the table to hers, slow, steady, unflinching. "Maybe not," he said, "but I need you here." The words landed in the room like a struck match. Too sudden to ignore, too dangerous to trust. Clara felt her heartbeat rise, because no one had spoken to her in weeks, as if her presence itself might matter more than her usefulness. She should have left in the morning. She knew that before dawn even broke. But hardship has a sly way of making small mercies feel like destiny. And by noon, she was rolling up her sleeves. By evening, she was stirring beans at his stove, as if her hands had always known where his pans were kept. And by the second day, the house no longer sounded abandoned. It sounded only lonely, which was not the same thing. Loneliness can be argued with. Abandonment cannot still. The plains do not let peace stay untested for long. By the end of the week, 3 men rode up from town with smiles, 2 polished for honest business. 1 was the bank's collector. 1 was the feed merchant, and 1 was Dorian Pike, whose wife had been in the ground barely 6 months before he started circling every unattached woman in the county like a hawk. Clara saw them from the window, and before Elias could step outside, she knew exactly why they had come. Men like that never ride together unless they smell blood or debt. The collector spoke first, loud enough to carry into the house, saying Barstow's note was past due, that winter was coming, that a man alone could not keep this place upright much longer. And Pike added with a smile, "Maybe what this ranch needs is a woman who knows her place." The sound Elias made then was low and terrible, not shouted, not wild, but full of the buried violence of a man who had spent too long mastering himself. He stepped off the porch with a stillness that made even the horses twitch, told the collector he would have his money after the cattle drive settled, told the merchant he would pay for feed and beef or not at all. And when Pike laughed and glanced toward the house, Elias moved one step closer and said, "You look at my door again and you'll be eating through a broken jaw." Clara felt fear then, but beneath it came another feeling, the dangerous comfort of knowing someone had chosen her side before she had to beg for it. That night they argued because fear always comes dressed as anger after danger has gone. Clara told him she was not a claim to be defended, not another thing on his land to be fenced and guarded. And Elias stood by the table with his hands braced against the wood. "I know that," he said. "But every time I turn around I see this world measuring what it can take from you. And I am done watching people take." It was the first time his voice cracked. And in the quiet that followed, he told her about the fever that had taken his wife, then his little girl, 3 days apart, about the tiny grave wrapped in snowfall, about coming into the kitchen months later and still reaching for a cup that no longer belonged to the living. Clara listened without moving, because some pain can only be honored by staying still long enough for it to breathe. When dawn came the next day, she found him in the barn trying to saddle a horse with hands that would not stop shaking. And that was the moment the truth became plain to her. Elias Barstow was not asking for a wife. He was asking not to disappear, asking for one witness, one voice in the house at the end of labor, one person to make his days mean more than survival. And because she understood that need too well, it frightened her more than Pike, more than debt, more than the winter clouds massing over the ridge. Then came the night the cattle broke, lightning struck south of the corral. The herd scattered in a mad dark wave of horns and muscle, and Elias rode out before the thunder had finished rolling. Clara should have stayed inside, but she grabbed the lantern, hitched the old bay mare, and rode after him into rain so hard it felt like gravel against her face. The prairie vanished into black sheets of weather, and somewhere beyond the wash she found him pinned under a splintered fence rail, his horse gone, his leg twisted wrong. This is where weaker hearts turn back. This is where love, or something very near it, stops being a word and becomes labor. Clara dropped from the saddle into knee-deep mud, dragged the broken timber off him inch by inch, tied the lantern to a post with one shaking hand, and when he gritted out, "Leave me, save yourself," she leaned down with rain running off her hair and said, "No, not this time, not to you, not to me." She got his arm over her shoulder, half carried, half hauled him to the mare. And by the time they reached the barn, both of them were soaked through, bleeding, breathless, and too alive to pretend any longer that they were strangers sharing weather. For 2 days she tended him, set the leg as best she could with stubborn nerve, changed cloths on the fever that followed, slept in a chair by his bed with a shotgun across her knees, because Pike's kind always visited when they heard a man was hurt. And sometime in the second night, Elias woke to find her there in the lamplight, head bent, one hand still resting near his wrist. He watched her a long time before speaking. "Clara," he said, and her eyes opened at once. "I meant what I said. Maybe I don't need a wife. Maybe that ain't the name for any of this. But I need you here because this house remembers how to die when you're gone." Outside, the storm had passed, and dawn was beginning to silver the edges of the window. What stood between them was not rescue, not convenience, not some desperate bargain struck by winter. It was recognition, fierce and unsentimental. Two wounded people seeing in each other not a cure, but a reason to keep building anyway. Clara rose from the chair and crossed to the window, looking out at the soaked earth, the broken corral, the long work waiting in the morning light. Then she turned back to him, her face tired, changed, braver than when she had climbed those porch steps. "I won't stay where I'm only needed because you're lonely," she said softly, and Elias answered from the bed. "Then stay, because I will spend every day proving you are more than that. There are promises spoken in churches, and there are promises spoken in houses that have survived enough sorrow to make ceremony seem small. Clara walked back to the bed, sat beside him, and took his weathered hand in both of hers, not like a bride, not yet, but like a woman accepting the risk of hope with her eyes open. Outside, the first sunlight touched the barn roof, the pasture, the leaning fences, and somewhere in the kitchen, the kettle began to sing. Thin and ordinary and beautiful, she breathed in, steady now, and gave him the only answer worth trusting. I will stay while truth stays with us. And for the first time in longer than either dared count, the house did not feel haunted. It felt inhabited. And in that quiet, battered ranch on the edge of a hard country, where love arrived not as sweetness, but as endurance, two people sat side by side and watched the day come in, knowing the world outside would remain cruel, knowing debt and gossip and winter would return, knowing also that some hearts are not saved by being wanted, but by being seen, and that sometimes the bravest words ever spoken on the frontier were not "I love you," but "stay," and the answer, whispered back against all evidence, was yes.